Preecha had always been captivated by the wild. From the time he was a child, he had found solace in nature, in the tangled vines and the hum of insects, in the rustle of unseen creatures. His heart beat for the untamed corners of the world, places where few dared to venture, and fewer still managed to leave unchanged. As a seasoned wildlife photographer, Preecha had journeyed to remote corners of Southeast Asia, capturing rare, unfiltered moments. An elusive tiger stalking through the tall grass, a vibrant bird flitting from branch to branch, the beauty of nature in its purest form. Thailand's jungles had always been his sanctuary, their dense foliage and mysterious depths a perfect backdrop for his art. But this time, something felt different. The locals near the village where he had set up base spoke in hushed tones about the spirits of the jungle. At first, Preecha had dismissed it as little more than superstition. Old wives' tales passed down through generations to scare outsiders. After all, the jungle had always been his safe haven, a place where he felt connected to something greater than himself. But the more he listened, the more something in the back of his mind began to stir. They said the jungle wasn't just a forest. It was alive, guarded by ancient spirits who protected it from anyone who might dare disturb its sanctity. Spirits? In the jungle, Preecha had laughed it off, his mind set on capturing the beauty of the wild. It's just a place of beauty, a place for photography. Despite his skepticism, a small seed of doubt had planted itself in his mind. And on this trip, that seed would grow into something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The morning air was thick with humidity as Preecha ventured deeper into the jungle. His boots sank into the soft, damp earth, and the dense canopy above allowed only a few streaks of sunlight to break through. The air smelled of damp leaves and rich soil, the kind of earthy aroma that always made him feel grounded. The jungle was alive with sound, bird calls echoing through the trees, the rustle of small animals scurrying through the undergrowth, the hum of insects in the heat. Preecha loved it here. It was his natural habitat, but something felt different today. He couldn't quite place it, but the jungle felt tense. As he set up his camera near a small, secluded stream, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He paused, holding his breath. There was no sound. The jungle had gone eerily quiet. Nothing moved in the dense underbrush. Just the heat getting to me, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. But even as he tried to reassure himself, he couldn't shake the feeling. It was like the jungle itself was aware of his presence. Every time he moved, it felt as though the shadows followed, closing in around him. A twig snapped behind him. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, expecting to see some small creature, a monkey maybe, or a deer. But the clearing was empty. No movement, no animal. Preecha took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. He focused back on the stream, adjusting his camera settings. It was just his imagination. The heat, the isolation, it was all playing tricks on him. But the sense of being watched didn't dissipate. It only grew stronger, more insistent. Hours passed, and Preecha continued his work, though the strange sense of being watched lingered like a shadow, just beyond his consciousness. He moved deeper into the jungle, following the stream as it wound its way through the forest. The sun had shifted overhead, and the jungle was growing darker, the shadows longer, as dusk approached. That's when he saw them, a series of wooden totems, tall and weathered, carved into the trunks of several ancient trees. They stood in a small clearing, half obscured by vines and moss, but unmistakable. The totems were humanoid in shape, though their faces were grotesque, hollow eyes carved deep into their wooden faces. They seemed to stare directly at him, their empty gazes following his every movement. Preecha froze, his camera hanging loosely by his side. The totems were older than anything he had seen in this part of the jungle. Older even than the ancient temples scattered across the region. Who would carve these things here? He whispered to himself. And why? He stepped closer, running his fingers over the rough surface of one of the totems. The carvings were intricate, more detailed than any he had ever seen. Ancient symbols, patterns that looked almost alive, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. as if the totems were not merely carvings, but something more, a conduit for an ancient force. Just carvings, Preecha muttered under his breath, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes flicked nervously over his shoulder. Something wasn't right. How could he have missed these totems all these years? They were clearly ancient, yet he had never seen them before. As he reached for his camera to snap a few shots of the eerie figures, something caught his eye. In the distance, between the trees, a faint glow. 2 orbs of light. At first, he thought it might be the reflection of fireflies, but the lights were too bright, too deliberate. His fingers tightened around his camera. Slowly, he raised it to his eye, focusing in on the orbs. They blinked, then disappeared. He blinked and refocused, but now they were back, closer this time. The orbs seemed to move, weaving in and out between the trees like eyes, unblinking, unwavering. Suddenly, the forest went silent. Not a single bird chirped, not a single rustle from the underbrush. Preecha's heart raced. He lowered the camera slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. The eyes, the orbs, they weren't just a trick of the light. They were real, and they were watching him. As Preecha stood frozen, staring into the shadows where the orbs had been, a figure emerged from between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its pale, sinewy body was draped in vines and moss. The figure's skin was a ghostly white, almost translucent, and its eyes, those eyes, were wide, glowing like twin lanterns in the darkening jungle. Preecha couldn't breathe. His camera trembled in his hands as he tried to raise it, but the figure's eyes, those unblinking, glowing eyes, were locked onto him. It was like they could see into his very soul. The figure moved forward, slow and deliberate. Preecha's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his gaze away. It was as though the jungle had become a living, breathing entity, and this figure was its manifestation, a guardian of some ancient, forgotten power. The figure took another step, and Preecha's breath caught in his throat. It was too close now. His finger was frozen on the shutter, but he couldn't bring himself to take the shot. Something deep inside him screamed that he needed to leave, to get out, to run far away. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward once more, and Preecha bolted. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned and fled, the sound of his boots pounding against the earth drowned out by the frantic beating of his heart. As Preecha sprinted through the jungle, the feeling of being pursued was overwhelming. The whispers in the trees had returned, louder now, echoing through the air, filling his mind with fear. Leave this place, leave now. His mind spun. Were these the spirits the villagers had warned him about? Had he awakened something ancient and vengeful with his intrusion? Or was it something else, something far darker? He could hear the soft rustling of something moving through the jungle, too fast, too quiet. Was it the figure? Was it following him? Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves sent his pulse spiking. He ran harder, his legs burning with exhaustion, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The jungle was closing in on him, trapping him in its dark embrace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke through the trees, emerging at the edge of the jungle. Panting and covered in sweat, Preecha turned to look back, half expecting to see the figure standing in the shadows, waiting for him to return. But there was nothing. The jungle lay still, the eerie glow of the eyes now gone. The air, thick with tension moments before, was suddenly quiet. Preecha stumbled to his feet, gasping for air. He looked down at his camera. It was still in his hands, though his fingers felt numb around the grip. His mind was a blur of confusion and fear. Was it real? He whispered to himself, staring at the camera's display. But the final shot, the last photo he had taken, was there, staring back at him. The figure. It was so close now, its face a pale, ghostly blur, but its eyes, those glowing eyes, were clear. They were locked on his camera, locked on him. And in that moment, Preecha realized something chilling. The jungle had been watching him all along, not as a photographer, but as an intruder, an unwelcome guest in its sacred domain. Back at his hotel, Preecha couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle had never truly let him go. Every night, as he lay in bed, the whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder. He tried to upload his photos to his laptop, hoping to make sense of what he had experienced. But as the images loaded, his stomach sank. In every shot, the glowing eyes were there. In every photo, the figure was closer, as if it had been following him, inching toward him with every step. And in the final image, the last shot before he had fled, there it was, the figure's face hovering inches from the camera lens. The eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at him. He stared at the screen, his hands trembling. He hadn't imagined it. It had been real. The jungle wasn't just a place of beauty. It was alive, and it was guarding something that had been there long before he had set foot in its depths. Weeks later, Preecha received an email from a local historian. The message was short but unsettling. You should not have come. You awakened them. The jungle will not forget. Preecha stared at the screen, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The message continued. There are others in the jungle. The spirits are only the beginning. The guardians see everything. They are always watching. Preecha's terrifying experience was not just a story, it was a warning. For anyone who dares to step into the jungle, remember this. The jungle is not just a collection of trees and animals. It is a living entity, ancient and powerful, and it guards its secrets fiercely.